We are in a situation now where there's the possibility of the return to large-scale conflict of a sort that we haven't seen in many years in Myanmar. Of course, armed conflict, civil war has been ongoing there throughout the last few decades, but with the renewed attacks on the Korean National Liberation Army and violence also in Shan State and Kachin State, there seems to be the possibility of a return to intensive civil conflict in Myanmar potentially of an unprecedented scale, not seen in many years.
Let's talk a little of those disparate insurgencies. We've been very conscious, of course, of the Rohingya, but there, as you pointed out, there are many of those groups. They are looking at uniting. There was a meeting held amongst a number of them to try and get some cohesion to topple the junta. Is that a possibility?
There have been attempts to unify groups in the past. Indeed, there have been a variety of alliances that have formed, including in recent years, but certainly also in the wake of the last large-scale nationwide protests in 1988. There were alliances between some of the armed groups and also attempts to support students and others that fled from the urban areas who then established their own armed group. Unfortunately, historically, the alliances haven't remained stable for a variety of reasons because the various groups have their own interests that are tied to territories and populations in those areas, and also because of the scale of the effort that would be involved to overcome the amount of violence that's used by the central army, the state army, has been quite considerable. In other words, the efforts have been incommensurate with the effort that would be necessary to succeed.
Yeah, and what sort of resources have these groups had? Many of them have almost sort of petered out to a degree under the relationship that when Aung San Suu Kyi was in power.
Well, it's not the case that they petered out, but a variety of them entered into ceasefire agreements. Some of those ceasefire agreements had occurred under the previous semi-civilian government of U Thein Sein, the former General Thein Sein, in the first part of the 2010s. And there were also ceasefire agreements, bilateral arrangements that were formed in the 1990s and 2000s under the former military juntas. So many of these groups have been in and out of ceasefire agreements over a variety of years. And they've accrued resources from a range of different places, depending on the part of the country that they're in, very often through trading or taxation, resource extraction across the borders of neighbouring countries.
So there's also discussion around whether they could successfully form a front with the protest movement that is within Myanmar itself, these young people who've grown up believing that they could have freedoms and some form of democracy. Is that a possibility?
Well, it's a possibility, but if it occurred in a way that might potentially endanger the military's hold on the country, it would be unprecedented. As I said already, there was an alliance that formed after the last nationwide protests in 1988 between the students that fled from the urban areas and met with the armed groups in the frontier regions. However, although that alliance held in some form or another, it was never possible for it to mobilize in a way that would result in the overthrow of the prior dictatorship. The question is whether or not presently there may be an armed uprising of some sort from the urban areas or an attempt at an armed uprising from the urban areas. That would indeed be something that we had not seen previously if it was supported and in some way armed by groups in the frontier areas. In all likelihood, that would be disastrous. It would be a bloodbath.
Yeah, because you talk of the brutality with which the military would crack down, and we saw just in Kachin State very quickly. So it would not necessarily bring the junta to its knees or even give them any pause to reconsider their approach.
It would be a pretext for violence on a much greater scale than we've seen presently. The junta adopts the position, in fact it's stated it more or less word for word in the state media, that it's been restrained in its current use of violence, and indeed the sense is that it could do a lot more than it has already.
We've seen a lot of pressure domestically coming on the Australian government to do more, you know, offer visa extensions to those who may be in danger. It is sort of perplexing as to what the international community can do to bring any pressure to bear on the junta.
Indeed, this is a government that has, or a military rather, that's long been resistant to external pressure. That was the case throughout the 1990s and 2000s. And the impression that we get presently is that it's returned to the practices hitherto. There are no strong incentives for any of the senior leadership now to back down from the position they have. There's no easy way out of these arrangements for them. But insofar as you refer to what the Australian government, for instance, can do, we can certainly start by accepting that we have a duty of care for those Myanmar citizens who are currently in the country, many of them who have come, for instance, as students on scholarships from the Australian government, and provide them with the support and solidarity that they need until such a time as conditions in Myanmar change.
Yeah. Nick, appreciate your time. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much.